Welcome to the Raising Arrows podcast, where we discuss all things large family home and homeschool. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Raising Arrows podcast. I'm Amy Roberts from raisingarrows.net, and this is episode number 138, Tests Don't Teach. I have been homeschooling now for about 20 years, if you can believe that. My oldest son just turned 25. I started from the beginning of his education, and I still have 7 children at home that I am homeschooling. And over the years, I realized something as I was educating these children that was profound to me and actually totally changed the way that I homeschool. I learned that tests don't actually make for a good gauge of how much your child is learning. Now, we all remember back in the day when we were in school and you would try to cram all the information into your head and then dump it out all over the page and then promptly forget it. I remember this even in college where I'd cram, answer all of the questions and then never remember what in the world we'd even talked about 30 minutes later. However, I do remember the conversations we had. I have a degree in English, and I can tell you that my favorite classes were once I got to the 300 level classes and above, because we would sit in a circle and we would discuss books. And I learned so much, and it was so enjoyable. I looked forward to going to college during those days because we had such meaty, interesting conversations. And I learned so much from not just the professor, but also from the other students in the class. And we could discuss and we could hash out things, and we may not agree, but we could talk about it and we could learn from each other. And so those were my favorite classes in my major, was when we got up to the more upper level classes and we actually discussed things instead of there being a bunch of tests and multiple choice and those sorts of things. Now, I did have to write a lot of essays, a lot of papers, a lot of research papers. Those kinds of things come with the territory when you have an English degree, but I enjoyed that as well because I had learned how to communicate and how to take that information and separate it out into pieces and hand it over to my teacher in a complete format that made sense and got across the point that I was trying to make. And so as I was teaching my own children, I actually took that paradigm from those 300 plus level courses in college, and we created a homeschooling environment that was more discussion based. And I'm actually going to do a podcast here in the future on that discussion-based education. But initially here, I just want to talk about testing and what you can do instead. Before we dive in, I want to tell you that this podcast today is sponsored by my book, Large Family Homeschooling. In that, I talk about a lot of different ways that you can homeschool a large family and make it less of a burden on yourself. And some of those ways definitely include not teaching to the test, not having a bunch of tests, but doing this discussion-based model and some of the other things I'm going to be talking about in this podcast. So check out my book, Large Family Homeschooling. It is geared toward families that have 4 or more children, but the concepts in there work for families of all shapes and sizes. The link for that is down in the show notes, so go check that out today. Okay, so a little bit about why tests don't actually teach your children. Tests are often a regurgitation of facts and figures. That's really all you can put into a test. You can't really disseminate what somebody thinks about something. You can't really figure out if they've actually solidified it in their minds. Essays do a little bit better of a job of that, but even then, what really helps you to know if a child has pulled the information out of what they're reading or out of the conversations they're having is to simply have a conversation with them. Now, the Charlotte Mason method of education uses a word called narrating. The word narrating often conjures up images of a child speaking back exactly what they learned when they read the book, and mom listening there and trying to decide if the kid actually read the book or actually knows the stuff that was in the lesson. That's always what I felt like narrating was. It was very static and it was very one-sided. The child did the talking, the mom listened. To me, that's just not quite enough. And it's also a little boring. It's a little boring for mom and it's a little boring for the kid. It reminds me of book reports, if you will. Do you remember those? You'd read the book, you'd stand in front of the class and you'd tell the class what you learned from the book, or you'd have to write something about the book. They're typically a little bit boring. And I don't want my kids to find education and knowledge and the things that they're learning to be boring. However, I know that there are Charlotte Mason homeschoolers who do not see narration that way. They see it more as a discussion. And that's what I would have you lean into, is that discussion. Let's talk about this. Tell me a little bit about what you learned about this character. And then as you catch little things in what your child says, draw that out of them. Get a little more information from them. I have a 10-year-old who doesn't typically like to fill in the blanks for me on the stuff that he's read, even though I know he understands it. So I tend to have to kind of draw things out of him. I listen to him and I listen to what he's saying and I ask him more about this character that he mentioned or this event. And I do it in a way where it's more of a discussion, like, I'm interested. I want to know. I told him one time, I actually haven't read that book. Can you tell me more about it? I might want to read that. What did you find interesting about it? So rather than him just narrating to me what happened in the book like a book report, we had a discussion about it. And I, at the end of it, said, I think that sounds like a really great book. I think maybe I'll use that as a read aloud sometime for the younger girls. But besides that, I knew he had read the book. He'd understood the book. I wanted to know if he enjoyed it. I wanted his opinion of it. And so we talked about it. It was not just him standing there telling me. We talked through it and discussed it. It was a conversation. And that will tell you much more than any test could ever tell you. Plus, it tells you what stuck out to your child as important information, because tests tend to tell you what's important. And we have to realize that that's not always what is important in education. God made us infinitely unique human beings, and that is what helps us to be a well-rounded society, is when we have these different opinions, things strike us differently, we're able to share about different pieces of information. We all come together as a puzzle piece. The body of Christ, remember those verses? You're not all ears, you're not all eyes. And so we want to honor the uniqueness of our children, and we want to hear their opinions, what stood out to you, what was interesting to you. That also helps us to get to know them better as individuals and helps us to educate them better when we know what makes them tick and the things that are interesting to them. And tests just tend to put children in a box and tell them what to think. And then they have to just regurgitate that information from somebody else's thought process, somebody else telling them what's important. And I don't think they ever truly learn, particularly if they're not connected to the information that they're regurgitating. If they don't care, and most kids don't, if they are not invested in that educational information, then the regurgitation of it absolutely is not going to stick. They're never going to go back to that information again, other than to take a test and make sure that they get a good grade on it. You cannot say that getting a good grade on a test or a bad grade on a test means that the child has absorbed that information. It's not a good way to find that out. Another thing I want you to consider is how you learn as an adult. When you have something that you need to figure out, what do you do? How do you learn things, and how do you really get it into your brain and learn it? There's lots of different theories of education, and there's lots of different ways that people learn. Some people are very visual. Some people need to write things down. Some people need to hear it. Some people need a mix of all different kinds of things, including hands-on and lots of other things to help them to absorb the information. So think about yourself and how you learn, and then think about how your individual children learn. Now, you don't need to have different classes for every single kid. You simply need to infuse bits of that into everything that you do with them, and not be upset when something doesn't work for them that maybe would be perfect for you or for another kid, but it just doesn't work for them. For instance, I have a 17-year-old who is incredibly auditory, so much so that reading from a book tends to be maddening for him. but he also is very hands-on. So just hearing the information read to him doesn't always stick for him. In fact, he does a lot of audiobooks, and he will actually clean his room or paint or fiddle with something while he's listening, because the two things together solidify it in his mind. He absorbs the information better when he is doing a couple of things at a time. Now, you would think there's no way I can't multitask like that. And actually, I don't auditorily process very well at all. I have to actually read the information and write it down in order to absorb it. I literally take notes in almost every single book I read. I take notes at church. I take notes when I listen to sessions online for either blogging or church-related stuff, or anything I do, homemaking stuff. I take notes on everything because that's how I absorb the information. Some people are very visual, and so a video would be a better way to communicate the information to them. A YouTube video on some sort of chemical reaction would actually benefit them more than doing the chemical reaction themselves. They will retain more because they watched somebody else do it. And then likewise, there are kids who actually need to do the experiment themselves in order to really solidify it in their brains. So you've got all these different unique individuals in your home that you are trying to teach. And I know it can be a little scary and frustrating to think, I've got to figure this out for every single one of them. But thankfully, a lot of these can be intertwined, and you can actually end up teaching all of your children together if you create kind of a robust environment. And a lot of that starts with that discussion-based education that I was talking about, and that I will be talking about in a future podcast. And I will share with you exactly how we do this. But right now, I really want you to focus on wrapping your brain around not trying to test everybody all the time for information that you actually want them to absorb, information you actually want them to keep in their brains for longer than 30 seconds. I want you to think of this a little bit like on-the-job training. Think about a doctor. In medical school, they're learning all sorts of things, but they really don't learn how to be a doctor until they practice it, until they are on the job doing the things that doctors do. They can have all of that information in their heads, but it really is somewhat meaningless until they practice it. And granted, not everything you're going to teach your children is something that can be practiced. But with that discussion, with that conversation, with those hands-on things or the video or somebody reading a book to them, they begin to absorb that material. And then when you have the conversation about it, that's where they're putting it into practice. They're thinking through what they heard and you're talking about it. This reminds me of a video I recently watched from Sally Clarkson, where she was talking about having all these dignitaries and people from other countries into her home when they lived in Europe, and how they discussed political matters, geographical matters, all kinds of things. And she said she learned so much from talking with these other people, things that she never would have learned if she'd just read about it or somebody who was an uninterested party would tell her about it. This was real world practicing that knowledge and that information. And it is absolutely in line and in step with our faith as Christians. We are not supposed to just be hearers of the word. We are supposed to be doers of the word. You cannot sit still and be a do-nothing Christian, because that information permeates your very being. It becomes part of the conversation. And in doing so, it becomes part of who you are in everything that you do and in every aspect of your life. And that soaks in and absorbs in and becomes who you are. It becomes your identity. So this is really a Christian worldview kind of education. It's not a teach to the test. It's not try to get all the answers right so I can get to heaven kind of thing. We need to realize that we are teaching unique individuals entrusted to us by the Lord, and not just throw information at them and then test them to make sure that they have a 30-minute recall on that information. That's just not a good way to teach your children. And I know that is so outside the box. So I want to give you a few resources that I think will help you with this idea. First of all is my book, Large Family Homeschooling. I talk in there about corporate homeschooling, where we homeschool together. And I have a lot of stuff on my blog as well under the heading of morning time. But corporate homeschooling in my book, Large Family Homeschooling, talks about different ways that you can bring all of your children together and teach them in a way where they actually retain the information. So check that out. I'd also encourage you to check out Clay Clarkson's book, that's Sally's husband that I mentioned earlier, Educating the Wholehearted Child. This is a tome about how they educated their children. And while there's a lot of information in there that I haven't been able to implement in my homeschool, it is the overarching philosophy of homeschooling that I want you to gather from that book. And in the meantime, hopefully find some things in there that you can implement. And I actually would encourage you to get just about any of Sally Clarkson's books. They are all very, very good, and they speak to this awe and wonder and joy that she exudes and that she poured into her children. She has a new book that I can't say yet exactly how I feel about it because I haven't read it yet, but it's Awaking Wonder, and I actually just got it. It is sitting right here beside me right now, and the tagline is Opening Your Child's Heart to the Beauty of Learning. So I think this is also going to be a good resource for realizing that tests don't teach. They aren't a good way to educate your child. They aren't the be-all, end-all. Now, I'm going to give you one caveat here. I realize that there are some of you who have to teach your children how to take a test. There are things like ACTs and SATs. There are things like end-of-year evaluations that some states require. However, don't make that your only goal. Make sure that you are having these discussions. Teach your child how to take a test, but don't make it the end educational goal of your homeschooling years. That will ruin knowledge and wisdom for your child. That will ruin their homeschooling years because it's not the way that children and people in general actually learn things. So make the test a secondary. Tell them, I'm going to teach you how to take a test. And tell them why you're going to teach them how to take a test. And just make sure that they realize it's just an extra. It doesn't actually say anything about them as a person. It doesn't say anything about them as far as what they have learned over their homeschooling years. It's just a thing that people like to have to help them know whether or not you've learned the things they would like you to learn. And I will tell you, my oldest son did take the ACTs because he went straight into a private university from our homeschool. My second child did not take the ACTs. She went to a junior college on post. We're a military family, and she got her gen eds out of the way. And by that point, nobody cares if you have an ACT or SAT score. She went straight into private school from there. My oldest graduated with a 4.0, and my next oldest also still continues to have a 4.0. She is a junior this year. They learned how to take tests. It was not a big deal that we didn't take a bunch of tests over the years. I taught them toward the end of their homeschooling years how to take a test, and then we just moved on because that was not the main thing. And even now, my oldest daughter is going to school to be an American Sign Language interpreter, and her testing is all sitting in front of the professor and signing back and forth and answering questions that way. It's not even a traditional testing atmosphere, even in college. And I think that some schools and colleges are starting to realize that the information is not retained very well when it comes to testing. I think there are a lot of classes out there and professors out there who are seeing that is not helpful and that testing does not really create good students. It doesn't actually teach the information. Unfortunately, the public school system has not quite caught up to that concept, but there are individual classes and teachers within the public and private school system that do realize that and don't try to teach to a test. But many of these teachers have their hands tied, and they have to do something that shows the government that children have learned the things that the government deems to be important. And the only way for an entity to figure out if a large group of people have actually learned something that they want them to learn is to have a straight across the board testing system. And unfortunately, I just think that does a huge disservice to our children. But I cannot change the system. All I can do is change how I teach. And I hope that in this process, you begin to change how you teach. The tests are not the be-all, end-all. Discuss things with your children, add in video, hands-on, auditory things, and get that on-the-job training and teach them from a Christian worldview that says they are individuals and that testing does not make or break them as followers of Christ. Friends, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Raising Arrows podcast. We will see you next time.